Get his boxes off my lawn. That's the future of this house. Marcus Halloway stood on the circular driveway of the mansion he had built with his own 2 hands, watching 2 movers his wife had hired carry his belongings out onto the grass, while Vanessa Halloway laughed into the shoulder of a man named Julian Voss, a hedge fund manager 11 years younger than Marcus, with a jaw that looked sculpted rather than earned. Nobody had told Marcus this was happening. He'd come home from a site inspection to find the locks already changed and a folder of paperwork waiting for him on the porch. Paperwork claiming that under a hastily filed quitclaim, ownership of the Cedarbrook Lane estate had passed entirely to Vanessa 3 weeks earlier. "You built a nice house, Marcus," Julian said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Shame you never bothered to actually understand who legally owned it." Vanessa didn't stop laughing. She had learned, over the past several months, that laughing at Marcus in front of people made him smaller in a way that arguing with him never quite managed. Marcus said nothing. He picked up 1 box, set it in the trunk of his truck, and drove away without a single word. What neither of them knew, standing there congratulating themselves on the driveway of a house they believed they had just stolen, was that the actual deed to that property, the one recorded at the county courthouse 31 years earlier, had never once listed Marcus Halloway's name alongside anyone else's. It listed a trust his mother had created before she died, a trust with exactly 1 beneficiary and 1 condition for dissolving it, a condition that was about to be read aloud in a room neither Vanessa nor Julian were prepared to sit inside of. If you've ever been laughed at by someone who mistook your silence for surrender, stay with me. This story is going to feel unfair for a while before it feels like justice. Subscribe now, because you're not going to want to miss how this ends. Marcus Halloway had built Halloway Construction Group from a single flatbed trailer and a business card he'd printed himself at a copy shop in 1994. He had grown up in a modest 3-bedroom house on Cedarbrook Lane, the only home his mother, Eleanor Halloway, a widow who'd raised him alone after his father died in a workplace accident when Marcus was 6, had ever owned. Eleanor had scraped together enough, over 3 decades of working as a school administrator, to eventually buy the small lot next door when it went up for sale, patient enough to wait for the right opportunity. And when Marcus's construction business finally found its footing in his early 30s, mother and son had rebuilt the entire property together, expanding it lot by lot into the 11,000-square-foot estate that would eventually anchor one of the most desirable streets in the county. Eleanor had insisted, before she passed away from a sudden stroke 6 years earlier, that the property be placed into an irrevocable trust rather than transferred to Marcus outright, a decision Marcus had questioned at the time but ultimately respected, understanding it as his mother's final, careful act of protection, the same instinct that had guided every decision she'd made raising him alone. "You'll thank me for this someday," she told him, sitting in her attorney's office with the trust documents spread across the table. "Not because I doubt you, Marcus. Because I've watched too many good men lose everything they built to people who marry the money instead of the person." He hadn't fully understood what she meant. Not then. Vanessa Halloway had been a marketing director at a firm, Halloway Construction Group, contracted with for a series of luxury developments when Marcus met her, sharp and ambitious and genuinely, in those early years, deeply invested in the company's growth alongside him. She had helped him land contracts he wouldn't have known how to pursue on his own, had sat beside him through late nights reviewing proposals, had believed in the business before the business had given either of them much reason to. For the first several years of their marriage, that partnership had felt real, mutual, earned. Marcus had never once doubted that Vanessa loved him for exactly who he was, a man who still wore the same brand of work boots he'd worn since his 20s, who preferred walking a job site to attending a gala, who measured success in completed projects rather than magazine features. But success, as it often does, revealed appetites that had been quietly waiting underneath. As Halloway Construction Group grew from a regional contractor into a firm handling 9-figure commercial developments, Vanessa's relationship to that success began shifting in ways Marcus noticed but chose, for a long time, not to examine too closely. She began caring more about how the company's growth reflected on her, the profiles in regional business magazines, the invitations to circles Marcus had never particularly wanted access to, the specific social currency of being married to a man whose net worth kept climbing. She began gradually to find Marcus's simplicity embarrassing rather than grounding. Vanessa's mother, Diane Ashford, had never once believed her daughter had married appropriately. Diane, who had spent much of her own life quietly resentful of marriage to a man whose ambitions never matched her expectations, saw in Marcus exactly the kind of solid, unglamorous success she considered a compromise rather than an achievement. He built something real. I'll give him that, Diane would say to Vanessa over the years, in the careful, corrosive way mothers sometimes deliver criticism disguised as compliments. But real isn't the same as significant, sweetheart. There's a difference between building something and being seen building it. It was Diane who orchestrated the introduction to Julian Voss, framing it as an unplanned overlap at a charity auction her country club hosted, though she had, in fact, spent weeks quietly arranging the seating so that Vanessa would end up beside a man who represented everything Diane believed her daughter deserved and had somehow settled for less than. Julian was, in every visible way, the opposite of Marcus. He spoke fluently in the specific vocabulary of leverage, access, and positioning, the language of a man who had never once doubted his own value. And he delivered every sentence with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being believed. He told Vanessa she belonged in rooms she had never been invited into. He said it like he already held the key in his hand. Marcus first met Julian at a company anniversary dinner Vanessa had organized, an event formal enough that Marcus wore a jacket and casual enough that he skipped the tie. Julian arrived as Vanessa's +1 to a table of business contacts, and nobody had mentioned to Marcus beforehand that he'd be there. They shook hands near the bar. Julian's grip carried the particular energy of a man performing a courtesy he considered beneath him, and his eyes moved over Marcus with slow, deliberate assessment, the work-worn hands, the plain watch, the shoes clean but unremarkable. "You must be the contractor," Julian said, just loud enough to be heard, just casual enough to be denied later. "I pictured someone taller." Vanessa laughed. Marcus said nothing. He picked up his drink and walked toward the other side of the room, but he heard every word, and he did not forget it. The financial irregularities began quietly, the way these things almost always do. A new advisory arrangement appeared in Halloway Construction Group structure, labeled Strategic Capital Partnership, granting a firm connected to Julian Voss access to layers of the company's financial infrastructure that no outside consultant should have been able to reach. The paperwork had moved through the company's legal department during a stretch when Marcus was traveling for a major site acquisition in Charlotte, buried in routine filings that nobody flagged because nobody had reason to expect betrayal were in the shape of ordinary business. Then came agreements Vanessa had signed directly with Julian's firm without bringing them before Marcus or the company's small board of trusted advisors, agreements structured, once you understood the dense legal language, to quietly shift decision-making authority over specific projects toward a committee Julian's people effectively controlled. Then came documents carrying Marcus's signature that Marcus had never signed. He recognized the forgeries immediately, not because they were crude, but because he kept meticulous personal records of every document he actually reviewed, and these had never crossed his desk. He sat with that discovery for 3 days before he moved. The choice, laid out plainly, was simple to describe and considerably harder to live inside. He could confront Vanessa directly, force the conversation into daylight, and watch every piece of evidence get quietly deleted by people with more resources and less hesitation than he had. Or he could wait, documenting everything while letting them believe his silence meant confusion, grief, or simple defeat. Marcus called his longtime office manager, Renata Suarez, that same evening. Renata had been with Halloway Construction Group for 14 years, long enough to remember the company's flatbed trailer origins, long enough that her loyalty had never once been about the paycheck alone. She knew the company's internal systems better than almost anyone Marcus had ever formally hired to manage them. He told her what he'd found. He told her what he needed. Then he told her the plan would require patience beyond anything either of them had exercised before, that when the moment finally came, it would need to happen all at once, cleanly, with no window for anyone to react. "How long do we have?" Renata asked. "Long enough to get it right," Marcus said. "Not longer than that." From that night forward, Renata began quietly archiving deleted correspondence, cross-referencing suspicious contract against the company's approval records, tracing financial transfers through the layered shell structures Julian's team had built specifically to make them difficult to follow. She worked at hours nobody would notice, storing copies in places entirely outside the company's compromised systems. Marcus also brought in Theo Nakamura, the company's careful, methodical internal accountant, who had been quietly troubled by irregular numbers for weeks without knowing who he could safely trust with that unease. Marcus told him he could trust him completely. Theo got to work immediately. More importantly, Marcus made one additional call to Harriet Bell, the state attorney who had drafted his mother's trust 6 years earlier and who still, per Eleanor's original instructions, served as its sole administering counsel. I need to understand exactly what happens if someone tries to file a claim against the Cedarbrook property, Marcus told her, hypothetically. Harriet did not laugh at the question. She pulled the trust documents and reviewed them with Marcus for nearly 2 hours, confirming what Eleanor had apparently understood decades before anyone else in the family had reason to. The trust could not be dissolved, altered, or claimed against by any party through marriage, divorce, or any instrument other than Marcus's own signature, specifically invoking the dissolution clause his mother had written into the original documents. Any attempt to transfer, quitclaim, or otherwise claim ownership outside that single mechanism would be legally void from the moment it was filed, regardless of whose signature appeared on it. Your mother, Harriet said, closing the folder, understood something most people don't learn until it's too late. Protection only works if you set it up before you think you'll need it. Marcus did not confront Vanessa. He did not raise his voice. He went home each evening and behaved, for the outside world, exactly like a man slowly losing ground in his own marriage, quiet, distracted, increasingly absent from the parts of the household Vanessa had begun quietly reshaping around Julian's growing presence. What Vanessa did not know, and what Julian never bothered to properly investigate, was that the quitclaim their attorney eventually filed against the Cedarbrook Lane property, believing they had identified an oversight in decades-old paperwork, targeted an asset that had never once, in 31 years, belonged to Marcus personally. Their attorney, a sharp but overconfident real estate specialist Julian's firm retained, had reviewed the county's public property records, found Marcus Halloway's name associated with the address through decades of utility bills, tax correspondence, and informal ownership references, and concluded incorrectly that the underlying title was simply unclear enough to contest through a straightforward marital property claim. He had never requested the original trust documents. Nobody had ever needed to produce them before, because nobody had ever challenged the property's ownership before. That was a mistake the entire plan was quietly built on top of. The day the movers arrived, 3 weeks after that filing, Vanessa believed she was reclaiming something she and Julian had legitimately secured. She had genuinely convinced herself, through months of Julian's confident reassurance and her mother's steady encouragement, that Marcus's ownership of the estate had always rested on shakier legal ground than anyone previously realized, that this was less a theft than a correction. She laughed on that driveway because she believed she had already won. Marcus drove away that afternoon not toward a hotel, but toward Harriet Bell's office, where he sat for 40 minutes reviewing, line by line, exactly how the coming weeks would need to unfold to ensure that when the truth was finally revealed, it would be revealed in a room and in front of an audience that made the outcome impossible to spin, dispute, or quietly walk back. I want it read formally, Marcus told her. Not a letter, not an email. I want everyone who watched and get thrown out of that house sitting in a room when they hear exactly whose name has been on that trust since before Vanessa and I ever met. Harriet smiled for the first time that day. Your mother would have liked that particular detail. Over the following 2 weeks, while Vanessa and Julian settled comfortably into the Cedarbrook estate, hosting a small celebratory dinner for a handful of friends who congratulated them on the acquisition, Marcus stayed at a modest extended-stay hotel 11 minutes away, working quietly with Renata and Theo to finish assembling the evidence of Julian's financial infiltration into Halloway Construction Group. Theo's forensic accounting eventually mapped 26 irregular transactions across a 13-month period, funds moving between company accounts and entities connected to Julian's firm, authorized through channels that had deliberately bypassed the company's standard approval process. Several of those authorizations carried Marcus's forged signature, each one flagged in Theo's final report with a column marked signature verification status, every single entry reading not authenticated. Renata's parallel investigation uncovered internal messages between Vanessa and Julian, recovered from company servers before access could be fully locked down, laying out in specific Damning detailed their coordinated plan to isolate Marcus from operational authority at the company, while simultaneously pursuing the residential property as what one message casually referred to as the easy win, since he never bothered protecting it properly. Julian, believing the hardest part of his plan was already behind him, came to see Marcus directly 10 days after the eviction, arriving alone at Halloway Construction Group's headquarters, a gesture meant to signal his own confidence rather than any genuine desire for reconciliation. He sat across from Marcus in a small conference room and made an offer, proposing to purchase Marcus's remaining stake in the company at a valuation roughly 60% of what any honest assessment would confirm it was worth. Framing it as generosity, a clean exit rather than a prolonged fight, Julian assured him he was unlikely to win. "Vanessa chose me," Julian said, leaning back with the flat certainty of a man who had rehearsed a line and genuinely enjoyed the sound of it, "because she needed someone who could take her somewhere you never could. You laid the groundwork. I'll give you that much credit. But foundations aren't the part anyone remembers." Marcus listened to every word. What Julian did not know was that in the adjacent room, with the door left deliberately, legally ajar, Renata sat with a recorder running. Present in the space she had every ordinary right to occupy, doing work she did every single day. "I appreciate you coming in," Marcus said when Julian finished. Julian took that as acceptance and left the building believing he had just closed the final piece of a very good deal. The gathering where everything finally came apart was one Vanessa herself had organized, a small formal dinner at the Cedarbrook estate 3 weeks after the eviction, intended, according to the invitation she'd sent to a tight circle of friends and Julian's own business associates, to celebrate what she was calling, with the same careful language she'd once used inside Halloway Construction Group's boardrooms, a new chapter. Marcus had not been invited. He came anyway, arriving with Harriet Bell at exactly 7:15, 20 minutes after the first guests had settled into the estate's formal dining room with drinks in hand, admiring the house Vanessa was now, over appetizers, quietly describing the guests as hers. "You can't be here," Vanessa said, rising from her seat at the head of the table, the same table Marcus's mother had once served Sunday dinners on. "This is my home now, Marcus. The paperwork is filed." "It is filed," Marcus agreed calmly. "That's actually why I'm here." Harriet stepped forward and set a slim folder on the table beside Vanessa's untouched wine glass. "My name is Harriet Bell," she said, addressing the room with the unhurried authority of someone who had done this kind of thing before. "I represent the Eleanor Halloway Family Trust, which has held sole legal title to this property since 1994. I'd like to read a portion of the recorded trust documents into the record this evening, in front of everyone present, since a filing has recently been made against this property that the county recorder's office has already flagged as legally void." The room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when everyone senses the ground shifting beneath a conversation they thought was already finished. Julian stood. "This is a stunt. It's public record," Harriet said simply. "Filed 31 years ago, notarized, witnessed, and updated exactly once. 6 years ago, upon Eleanor Halloway's passing, at which point sole trusteeship transferred to her son, Marcus Halloway, per the original document's explicit terms." She opened the folder. "Would you like me to read the relevant section, or would you prefer to review the county's own certified copy yourselves first?" Nobody answered. Harriet read it anyway, slow and clear. Every guest at that table listened to language that made unmistakably clear exactly whose name, and whose name alone, had ever held legal authority over the house they were currently sitting inside. Diane Ashford, seated near the far end of the table in a chair that had, until that moment, felt like the seat of a woman watching her daughter finally arrive somewhere significant, set down her glass very quietly and said nothing at all. Vanessa's voice, when she finally found it, came out smaller than the version she'd used on the driveway 3 weeks earlier. "This is retaliation. Because I left you. I filed nothing tonight that wasn't already true the day my mother signed those documents," Marcus said. "You filed something that was never yours to file. That's the actual difference between what's happening right now." Julian's attorney, seated among the guests, leaned toward him and spoke in a low, urgent voice. Julian's jaw tightened, the first genuine crack Marcus had ever watched move across that particular face. Theo Nakamura, who had accompanied Marcus and Harriet that evening, stepped forward next, placing a second folder on the table. The forensic accounting report mapping 26 irregular transactions between Halloway Construction Group and entities tied to Julian's firm. I can walk through the full methodology line by line, if anyone at this table would like. Theo said, every figure is sourced and verifiable, including the forged authorizations carrying Mr. Halloway's signature. Renata played the recording last, Julian's own voice filling the formal dining room, flat and confident, describing Marcus's remaining company stake as something he should sell at 60 cents on the dollar because his position had been, in Julian's own recorded words, structurally weakened by recent changes. The recording ended. Nobody at that table reached for their wine. Marcus looked at Vanessa across the room his mother had built for him, one careful addition at a time. Across 30 years of patient, unglamorous work Vanessa had once genuinely admired before she'd learned to find embarrassing. You don't have to do this, Vanessa said quietly, and for one brief moment, the strategy fell away entirely, and it was simply two people who had once eaten takeout together at a folding table, looking at each other across a room that had suddenly gotten very small. Marcus let himself feel the full weight of that for exactly as long as it took to remember his mother's tomato plants along the back fence, the desk he'd once planned to build for a child who never came, the specific, deliberate cruelty of using his mother's house as a weapon against him. I know I don't have to, he said. I'm choosing to anyway. He turned to the room. The eviction filing against this property is void, effective immediately, for the county recorder's own confirmation this afternoon. Anyone still residing here has until tomorrow morning to vacate voluntarily before formal removal proceedings begin. He paused. As for Halloway Construction Group, formal fraud referrals go to the district attorney's office and the state financial regulator first thing tomorrow morning, along with civil recovery proceedings against every entity connected to tonight's other guests of honor. Julian left without another word, his attorney trailing behind him already dialing someone on his phone. Diane Ashford gathered her purse and slipped toward the door without looking at her daughter, moving through the room like a woman determined to behave as though she had never actually been present for any of it. Vanessa remained seated after everyone else began to rise, no longer laughing, no longer performing certainty for an audience, looking instead like someone who had always known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this particular outcome was possible and had simply chosen for months not to believe it would ever actually arrive. The weeks that followed were procedural rather than dramatic, the specific, undramatic weight of real consequences finally landing. Julian's firm faced formal fraud charges tied to the forged authorizations and the unauthorized financial infrastructure access, charges that Julian's attorneys contested loudly right up until the recorded conversation became part of the official record, at which point the contesting stopped considerably faster than it had started. Vanessa's claim to any portion of Halloway Construction Group was formally dismissed once Theo's forensic report confirmed her role in authorizing the fraudulent transfers without board approval. The divorce proceedings that followed were, by Marcus's own quiet design, kept entirely separate from the criminal referrals, handled cleanly through standard family court process rather than public spectacle, because Marcus had decided, long before that dinner, that his goal was never revenge theater. It was simply making sure the truth outlasted the version of events Vanessa had been counting on the world to believe instead. Marcus promoted Renata to chief operating officer within a month, a role that reflected work she had quietly been doing for years without the title or compensation to match it. Theo became the company's formal chief financial officer. Neither of them had asked for recognition. Marcus gave it to them anyway, the same way his mother had once quietly, patiently protected the one thing she knew mattered most before anyone else understood exactly why it would. On a cool evening the following spring, Marcus stood in the driveway of the Cedarbrook estate, back in full possession of a house that had never actually left his hands, watching the last of the season's light settle over the oak tree his mother had refused to let anyone cut down, no matter how many leaves had dropped across the driveway every November. He thought about what Julian had once said in that small conference room, that foundations weren't the part anyone remembered. Julian had been wrong about that, the same way he had been wrong about almost everything else that mattered. Foundations were the only part that determined whether anything built on top of them survived at all. Everything else, the flashier offers, the confident laughter, the borrowed certainty of people who mistook access for ownership, None of it lasted longer than it took for someone patient enough to read the actual paperwork out loud. If you've ever had to stay quiet while everything in you wanted to react, if you've ever protected something that mattered simply by refusing to let go of it before the right moment arrived, then you already understand exactly what Marcus understood standing in that driveway. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is nothing until the moment you do everything at once. If this story stayed with you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about patience, dignity, and people who build something real and refuse to let it be taken from them. We'll see you in the next one.